Hello again. It is time for COM 340, Pop Culture and Rhetoric. Today we're going to be analyzing with Bitzer. So last time we talked about Lloyd F. Bitzer and his sort of model for rhetoric, his rhetorical situation and definitions. We also mentioned how sort of limiting they can be. But for our uses, that can actually be beneficial. So today we are going to work at applying his model to artifacts, and in particular, artifacts that have an established persuasive mission. And by that, I mean things that we sort of know what they're trying to do. We're going to look at advertisements because at its core, we sort of understand what each advertisement's trying to do. It's trying to persuade us to either think a certain way about their brand or buy the product itself. But before we get there, before we start doing these analyses, we need to look at the model itself and the kinds of questions that it induces us to ask. So if we look back to fittingness under Bitzer, we get some questions that sort of inherently come from the concerns of fittingness. And that first one is, does it eliminate the exigencies? Does it take away those things that are the reason for the message, for the persuasion in the first place? Basically, the exigence under Bitzer, if you'll remember, is the thing that we don't want to be the case. So if it is the case currently, how do we remove it? And if it's not the case, how do we keep it from becoming the case? The next question is, does it meet audience expectations? The audience has an expectation for every piece of communication, and if we're not meeting those expectations or meeting the audience where they are, then our chances of actually persuading them to action are very low. So we need to make sure we're doing that. And the final sort of basic question is, does it operate within the constraints? Does an artifact function around the things that could keep people from being persuaded and acting upon the exigence? So those are the three questions that we've got to ask about artifacts, but each one of those questions, each one of those concerns of fittingness can also be broken down further and a little bit simpler to understand and ask even more questions of an artifact to give us a better result and a better idea of what's going on persuasively. Now, I'll add here that, of course, we can always do more complex general readings of artifacts. Of course we can. But the reason I like using Bitzer's model, or at least an interpretation of Bitzer's model, is because we sort of get what a 30-second commercial is trying to do. And though we can talk about things like color theory, and we can talk about music and soundtrack choices and how all this impacts us rhetorically, I think it's good to be straightforward with straightforward artifacts. And it doesn't get much more straightforward than Bitzer basically asking, did it work or not? So let's look at some of the smaller questions we can ask to get a better understanding of these three individual questions themselves. The first is questions of exigence. And the questions we want to ask are, what is the exigence? What is the thing that this piece of communication is trying to resolve? Okay, and then we want to ask ourselves, how might the exigence be removed? If this is something that we're trying to get rid of, then how do we actually get rid of it? What does it look like to do that? And then finally, a good thing to question is, why does the rhetor want the exigence removed? Why does the creator of this message, or the person behind it, want the exigence removed? If we wonder about those things, it'll get us closer and definitely enable us to answer that first initial question. The second things to look at is audience expectation. One is, who is the intended audience? Who is this for, so to speak? Who is the target of the persuasion? Now, when we answer this question, we also get a couple of other questions, or a couple of other included groups as well. So when we identify the intended audience, we also identify people who are not the audience, basically people who the message is not for, or at least not intended for. And how do we know who's the intended audience of a piece of communication, of a piece of rhetoric? It essentially tells us. If we analyze specifically looking for it, we can find it because it essentially tells us who it's for with how it operates. And we can sort of guess at the audience's own expectations in the same process, right? What do we know about what we've guessed the intended audience is and what they expect to hear? And we can guess at this using context clues, using the social scripts that we're aware of and the symbols that we know about. It can be a very experiential process in identifying how we know about different groups of people. And finally, we want to look at constraints. Now remember, constraints are the things that keep us from our mission of persuading people to eliminate the exigents. So we need to look at what are the constraints to removing the exigents. What are things that might keep us as the audience from acting upon the exigents? And if we can identify them, what they are, then we can ask, well, why are they constraints? Why do they keep us from doing something or thinking something? And if we know how they're constraints, and we can better identify how the artifact, how the message that we are analyzing functions to remove them. And those are all important things to be able to tell when you encounter an artifact. And not just with popular culture. Anything that you're analyzing, you want to be able to know how it functions, how meaning functions within it. But this is a way to sort of ask broadly, okay, what is it trying to do? How does it do it? And like I said, when we're dealing with very straightforward artifacts like commercials, I think a straightforward model is good. I think it's helpful. So we're going to watch together this Hardee's ad, and then we will talk about it and ask questions. So let's go ahead and take a look. That's not what I wanted.
You still talk to Stacy?
Yeah, finally replied to my DMs.
Where are you, babe? We're over here next to the barn.
I'm about to pet this cat right here.
Let me pet that cat.
Where's the cat?
Shoot the tiger. Go for Junior.
Junior, I think your dad is here.
What? Daddy, you're back. Yes.
Take that down. Put that up.
That was supposed to be a fresh ingredient. And then that lady got in there and her clothes flew off. It was windy.
Miss, would you please dismount that bull? Who's this?
This guy? I don't know. Him.
Shut up, Junior.
Yes, sir.
Hello, friend. You know, when I started this company, it was about one thing. Pioneering a new way to food. Daring food. Cut no corners food for you. To eat with your mouth. Walk with me. Keep the bull.
We're keeping the bull.
Then I passed it to the boy. He sowed his wild oats as a young man is wont to do, and well, he got a little hoo-hum. 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 Distracted.
Yeah, things got real weird. That video was just for charity. We actually raised a lot of money.
So I'm back to do what we do. What we've always done. Take a little flashback with me. It started how all great things started, with meat and fire. We pioneered the charcoal.
With my lettuce.
And people's cars needed to eat, so we made the drive-through a thing. I made a girl, made a boy, and well, we did things our own way. We brought your food straight to your table. Brought all natural beef to the burger.
I like this one, Daddy.
And brought bacon to damn near everything.
See, this is what I've been talking about. Food, not booze.
Shut up, Junior.
Yes, sir.
We're pioneers of the Great American Burger. The Great American made from scratch biscuit. we think of next. And that's a promise. Carl Hardy, Senior.
But Daddy, I just bought that car.
Buckle up, son.
Okay. An interesting ad, for sure, and one that I have been fascinated with since I originally saw it. And the reason that I think it's so interesting is specifically because of how it functions and what it's doing in the pantheon of Hardys. So if we look at these questions, we can figure out sort of what's going on with this advertisements from Hardy. If we look very basically and just try to figure out what's going on, just get the plot of this commercial, we basically have Junior, who's sort of like, I don't know, flaky millennial kind of guy, who's been running Hardee's and trying to use sex appeal and models to sell burgers, which is very strange. Rhetorically, you'll notice this odd connection in a lot of restaurant chains advertisements between consumption of food and sexuality, which is interesting and unnerving and worth looking into if you've never. But plot-wise, basically, the dad is back from wherever he has been and is displacing Junior and sort of like reinstilling certain things about the company. So instead of focusing on models and things like that, we can focus back again on the burgers, the great Americanness that Hardee's represents, as the commercial tells us. And so it gives us this narrative, right, about Hardee's and their branding. But let's go ahead and ask ourselves these questions and get into it a little bit more deeply and get into it rhetorically. So let's look at exigence and the question. What is the exigence here? I think the exigence here is the perception people have of Hardee's, in particular the perception of their branding. So they'd been using this strategy since the aughts and into the teens of having these sort of like provocative commercials trying to like push the envelope with nudity and things like that. But people didn't really like it, and there's been lots written about these Hardee's commercials, but people weren't into it. And so this ad was sort of an official and very large change to that strategy, a recognition that, hey, we get that you didn't like this advertising strategy, this branding strategy, so we're switching. How might the exigence be removed? Well, it's by changing people's opinion about what you're all about. The way to change an opinion is to work persuasively against that existing opinion. So for Hardee's, what they're doing is saying like, no, we recognize that we're going back to something better that existed previously. So it's like regrounding themselves in their origins, so to speak. And why does the rhetor want that exigence removed? Well, if you want to sell burgers, it helps if people have a good opinion of your brand. You don't hear people say, man, I hate what a burger represents, but I love their food. It just doesn't really happen too much. It doesn't happen a lot, with a couple of famous exceptions. But Hardee's has an invested reason to want people to think better of their brand. And so by acknowledging a sore spot with some of their consumers in their advertising, they're trying to either bring them back or say, listen, we hear you, and we're just going to, quote unquote, be ourselves, whatever that might mean for a brand. Very interesting sort of question there. Audience expectation. Who is the intended audience for this advertisement? Really, this short film, it's a over 3-minute spot, so it's probably not airing on TV, certainly not in full. Who's the intended audience? I don't know. I think it's anyone that was upset by Hardee's branding or Hardee's consumers sort of in general. What does the audience expect? Well, they probably just didn't want to see those kinds of advertisements. It could be that simple, right? The intended audience, just Hardee's customers or anyone with that conception of Hardee's as a brand. And what does the audience expect? I'm not sure. Um, it depends on what we expect from an apology. So that can be different amongst different social groups. Um, if you're just a general burger fan, you might not care how they advertise your burger. And so the audience expectations there, a little broad, in part because this feels more like an announcement than a targeted ad. The targeted audience can be very broad. Pretty much, do you know about Hardee's? Do you know how we've been advertising? Well, here's something different. Um, and so you want to make sure that we acknowledge that in our analysis. You don't just want to say, oh, this is exactly the intended. Well, it's like, no, for this one, it's pretty broad, right? They just want to let everyone know. So the expectations are going to be a bit broad as well, but I think it does a decent job of addressing a lot of the concerns that were voiced by critics before this commercial was created. And finally, let's look at constraints. What are the constraints to removing the exigence? Well, one is that people's opinions of things, once they form them, they can be pretty sturdy. And to change their opinion, you have to work doubly hard to say, no, that's not me, this is me, and here's why. One thing that the commercial does well that I think helps skirt around these constraints is that it narrativizes their branding. I wouldn't call it experiment, just strategies, right? Instead of saying like, listen, us and the people we pay to think of our marketing strategies, we were wrong here and we will change it going forward. They don't do that. They turn it into a story about Carl Jr., and then Carl Sr. coming back and like getting things back on track. It's a story, and we understand stories, and stories are more pleasant and engaging than sort of missteps of corporate engagement. One thing I think is interesting, just narratively about this commercial too, is that both Junior and Senior drive off together in his nice car. Where are they going? Why are they leaving work? They just made a bunch of changes. They should talk to their employees. That is poor organizational communication. Just come in, make a bunch of changes, and leave. I would not recommend that. But why are those things constraints? Again, because they're enduring, and our opinions of brands affect our purchasing of their goods. So, from a business standpoint, if this was affecting Hardee's business, then they need to find a way to get past those opinions, to get past that sturdiness. They've really got to reach out. And I think the way that they operate within those constraints is by narrativizing it, providing a story, providing a background of Hardee's and who they are. It's sort of redefining the brand. And that's a great way, because it's not just apologizing, it's saying, what we've been doing is bad because of this reason, even though it's an invented reason, and here's what we're about, and this is what we're doing going forward. So I think it's particularly effective there. And so looking at all of these questions, the fittingness questions, does it eliminate the exigencies? I think it works too. And if we want a very specific question or a very specific answer to that question, we can look at sales and see how sales went up or down or infected by this advertisement, this switch, and how they are advertising their burgers. But from purely rhetorical, I think, yeah, it works to eliminate the exigencies, right? Whether it works or not, well, we can tell. I think it works to do that, and so that's good, and I think that's enough for a positive answer there. So yes. Does it meet audience expectation? Well, because it's so broad and sort of restarts the story, I think yes. It gives a reason, if fictional, for why the advertisements were like this, and explains how they'll be going forward. So I think because of that setup, because of that composition, it does meet audience expectations. And does it operate within the constraints? Again, maybe sometimes by avoiding them and doing it through a narrative and characters. But it does. I think it operates within the constraints. I think it's an example of an advertisement, an artifact that works well and is persuasively effective through how it works and how it's composed. The question for you is, what are other advertisements you can think of that also work, that also accomplish their persuasive mission? And are there any that you know that are just a failure, that just don't seem to work? There are a couple more videos in this slideshow they'll let you watch on your own. One is a Sherwin-Williams advertisement, and one is a Skittles advertisement. And I'm curious to curious to know what you think about those two ads. So that's all for today. We'll continue looking at different ways to discuss artifacts later in this week. And I will talk to you then.